Sonic 1 on the Mega Drive, or Genesis, is an interesting game from a design standpoint for many reasons, most of which have been discussed to death. However, there is one small thing, an insignificant choice, that's never really been seen or explored again in any other classic Sonic game. It's a small peculiarity that I don't hear or see being mentioned outside of its existence simply being acknowledged. While it's possible that it doesn't come up much because it's fundamentally meaningless and uninteresting, it is nevertheless something that's been tumbling around in the back of my head for years, and so I wanted to cover it briefly here. In Spring Yard Zone Act 2, for some reason, there are two signposts you can find at the end of the level. They're both exactly above one another, but the top one is more difficult to reach, requiring a surprisingly awkward jump just before you reach the end of the act. They don't function differently from one another, and this kind of level exit never happens in any other act in the game, and is never really revisited or explored again in the future classic Sonic games, save for one example I'll cover later. That's kind of weird, right? It's already a weird level. I mean, what is it even supposed to be? Why are there seemingly random flashing words floating in the background? So I suppose if you're going to put some peculiar end-of-level oddity into any stage, this is the best fit. As for the other example I mentioned, if you found your way to this video, you probably already know what I'm talking about. In Sonic CD, Collision Chaos does feature two signpost exits, and it even shows up in the second act just like Spring Yard Zone. However, seeing as how the stages in that game function as analogues to those in Sonic 1, this seems to be simply a cute nod to the first game rather than any kind of independent design decision. According to Washima, Spring Yard Zone was the first map to be drawn and finished, which makes me wonder if, rather than being a one-off instance, this multi-signpost exit design was being considered for different zones early on in the game's development, before being ultimately dropped and the existing implementation in Spring Yard Zone just sort of left how it was. Maybe because someone liked the idea and wanted to do more with it, or because it was less effort to leave it alone. The only other area in the final game that strikes me as similar is the end of Starlight Zone Act 1. Here, it's possible to take a lower path through the level, which has the player climb up at the end, joining up with the other paths for the signpost exit. However, it's possible to run underneath the signpost on a little platform, triggering the end of level sequence from underneath. There is no second signpost here, but it is a curious addition, and again makes me wonder why it's here in the first place, although it does seem much less deliberate than the Spring Yard Zone second exit path. It's interesting to think about what the point of this was. The obvious function in the final game is a way to reward the player with extra rings to help them enter the special stage. However, if you look at the level chunks for Spring Yard Zone, it's easy to imagine the platform at the end of the level simply dropping Sonic off after collecting the extra rings, so that he falls down to the lower signpost. The chunks used at the end seem to be identical, which suggests it was a copy and paste job. But what if it wasn't? It's fun to imagine what sort of things you could do with this multi-signpost exit level design. Maybe originally special stage rings were going to be tied to harder to reach exits. Maybe you could travel to different zones depending on the exit you found, sort of like Super Mario World. The development of the first game seems to be shrouded in much greater mystery than the sequels, which is understandable as at this point the series was not a known quantity. We know that the original visions for both Sonic 2 and 3 were much more ambitious than what was finally delivered, so it's not hard to imagine they might have had, if not similar problems with scope, then, like most games, a lot of ideas that were changed or simply didn't make it into the final release. One other interesting possibility is that special stage entrances may have originally been intended to be found throughout the level, more like how Sonic 3 would implement them. One piece of evidence for this comes from Yasuhara's Twitter account, where his header shows a level layout for Green Hill Zone Act 1. This is cool on its own, but if we look closely, we can see a label Special Stage floating in the air here, just after the double S-loop section near the end of the act. It's hard to speculate too much from this, after all it's just some text and doesn't tell us anything concrete about the special stage implementation, but it's definitely interesting. It does suggest to me that at some point the big rings could have been in hard to reach places, originally requiring a specific jump or route through the stage, rather than being tucked behind hidden walls as is so often the case in Sonic 3. And there's actually potentially some more evidence for this if we look at the Sonic 1 prototype build, which was released by Hidden Palace in January of 2021. At this stage of development, The special stages hadn't been fully implemented, and the big rings, although their graphics are present in the game files, didn't show up at the end of the levels. As the cutting room floor documents, when Sonic touches the giant ring, instead of instantly disappearing like in the retail version, he instead momentarily gains a sparkle effect, after which he then warps off of the screen. They go on to speculate that it's probable the big rings would have been placed on the ground after the signposts, so that Sonic runs through them and is teleported. However, what if they were instead supposed to be placed in hard-to-reach areas? For example, above the S-loop mentioned before. It could be possible that this second route at the end of Spring Yard Zone, and potentially the underside of Starlight Zone, was intended as a more out-of-the-way route which would reward the player with a big ring. Ultimately, it's impossible to know, unless someone who worked on the game for some reason decides to talk about this tiny detail so many years after it was created. If you're one of the 2 or 3 people in the world other than me who find this extra signpost weird and interesting, then I hope you enjoyed this video and I'd love to hear your thoughts about it. For everyone else, I'm sorry.